The next talk is arguably one of the most important ones of the conference. It's titled, What It Took to Free Julian. As you probably know, if you're a Bitcoiner, if you're into this kind of thing, Julian Assange is now free. But what comes next is, to some extent, more important. This is going to be a powerful discussion that brings together some incredible individuals who have been deeply involved in the fight for Julian Assange's freedom. We're, of course, honored to have with us Stella Assange, a dedicated human rights defender and the wife of Julian, Gabriel Shipton, who is a talented film producer and a strong advocate for his brother Julian, and John Shipton, Julian's father, who's been at the forefront of advocating for his son's freedom as an advisor to the Assange campaign. Who of you came to the Lugano Plan B forum last year? Who was here last year? Great, so you presumably were here for the talk last year when Julian was not free. It's amazing, isn't it, that we're here today and he is free. Yeah, I think that does deserve a round of applause. And to guide us through this critical conversation is none other than Natalie Brunell. Natalie is best known as the host of the Coin Stories podcast and a well-respected voice in the Bitcoin space. She's known for her in-depth interviews and her ability to shine a light on the stories and people behind important movements such as Julian's Freedom Campaign. Today, she's going to help us unpack the incredible effort it took to bring Julian's story to the world and the ongoing battle for not just Julian's freedom, but what comes next? It's justice for freedom. So, Natalie Brunell, I'd like to welcome you to the stage. She's then going to introduce the panelists one by one. Natalie, please give it, everybody, please give it up for Natalie Brunell. I think you're there. Best of luck.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back here in Lugano. I was first here in October 2022, and I'm really honored to serve as moderator for this very critical panel. I would like to introduce on stage the family of Julian Assange, starting with Stella Assange, his wife, Gabriel Shipton, his brother, and John Shipton, his father.
Hi, Natalie. Hey.
Well, first of all, it took a long time to get here to talk about the freedom, finally, of Julian Assange. And I had the chance to watch his first public statement, which happened just a few weeks ago. I know you were right by his side. And something that he said that was really interesting to me was that he chose freedom over unrealizable justice. So talk to us a little bit about the road that led to this freedom, which doesn't sound very free at all.
Well, first of all, it took 14 years. Julian was first arrested in 2010, just 7 days after WikiLeaks started publishing Cablegate. And he was arrested in the UK, and he wasn't actually formally charged with on anything until he was forcibly kidnapped, essentially, from the Ecuadorian embassy in April 2019. And then the reality of what was going on in the background became public for everyone to see. The US had charged him, and after a month or so, charged him with 17 counts more under the Espionage Act. He was facing 175 years. The case should have been thrown out from the beginning, but the UK courts basically facilitated this extradition and delayed, found against him. And we were at a stage where actually, afterwards, the Wall Street Journal published behind the scenes about how a plea deal was reached. And this came out after he was released. And what we now know is that the US lawyers were basically telling the US that they were going to lose the case. And that they were going to resign because they couldn't, in good conscience, argue what the US was pushing for, which was basically criminalizing journalism. And so that was what was going on in the U.S. kind of DOJ. But what had actually happened was that there was a movement that built over years and years, and that there was a distaste for the prosecution of Julian, even within the U.S. administration. We know this has been the case throughout different administrations. There's always been an internal conflict. And even if we had won the next stage, Julian would still be fighting from prison for years to come. Even if maybe in 5 years' time at the European Court of Human Rights he would have won. But what's the point of that? You know, he'd already spent 5 years in prison, and his health was, I mean, I think everyone saw once he was stepping off that plane that he was really in a terrible state. And the pictures that came out from 4 weeks ago, you can see how much healthier he looks, but he was really in a terrible, terrible state, and he wouldn't have survived, essentially. So what's the point of winning in the courts after 10 years if it will cost you your life or damage your health irreversibly? So he chose freedom, but at a huge cost, at the cost of justice. So.
Gabriel, you have been an advocate of Julian's freedom for so long. How does it make you feel seeing him? I know that this isolation took such a toll, but how is he doing? What do you want people to know?
Well, yeah, great sense of relief watching him, walk off that plane onto the tarmac in Australia, knowing that he was safe, back home on Australian soil. I was totally overwhelmed. It had been such a focus for all of us for so many years, fighting for Julian and fighting for his freedom, that I was overcome with emotion at the time watching him get off the plane. But I think, I think it's important for everyone here to understand, the sort of steps and what it actually took, to free Julian. In that, I think Bitcoin has has had some similar problems around sort of demonization and narrative. Julian was demonized in the press for many, many years, and that is a narrative that we as advocates for him had to unwind. And there were films made, there were books, one film I produced, but just going out and talking to people about what's actually at stake and taking Julian out of the picture in a sense and talking about the issues. And that was very key to freeing him, is getting that, unwinding that narrative that had been put through the mainstream media a lot. But also, I think where the Bitcoin community and the broader crypto community really helped was that this was a very costly exercise to get Julian free. We're looking, I think, we're still tallying up everything, but you're looking at upwards of $30 million just across campaigning fees, legal fees. It was a global campaign, and tens of thousands of individual donations, as well as larger donations from some very wealthy Bitcoiners, people in the crypto community who really put their money where their mouth is when it came to what they stand for in terms of freedom of speech and general freedom of being able to say what you want, like what Julian represented, freedom of information. So I think that's really important to acknowledge, and so everyone here understands the contribution, the outsized contribution of the Bitcoin community and the broader crypto community in basically bankrolling Julian's freedom, particularly through, there was a DAO set up, Assange DAO, and that had 10,000 individual contributors, and that was very important to really pay for the cost of getting him free.
Wow, that's really powerful to hear. I want to circle back to some of those topics, but first, John, as a father, I can't imagine how difficult it was to watch all of this and see the case evolve. Tell us your reaction.
I've been here 3 times talking to you guys. Julian's banged up in a prison, so in a lot of respects, we have to focus on the circumstances of Julian Assange, not our own. I'd like to add, if we stand on the mountaintop and look back to 2010 and the releases that Julian, WikiLeaks, Chelsea Manning and others made, you'll see a crux of a phenomenal change which is embraced at that time. Germany, the engine room of the European community, one of the most important industrial nations in the world, had a 3.4% growth. Now, this year, it's 0.2. So you see the phenomenal understanding that the world received from Assange and Manning, WikiLeaks, was a library enabling us to measure an unfolding of the geopolitical circumstances of the world. To add to that meeting in Kazan, I was there. Three of the world's 4 largest economies were at the meeting. The BRICS have a total annual turnover of 60 trillion. They're 45% of the world's population. They contain a total of 10, 11 nations, plus 13 who have applied, plus another totaling, including those 13, 40 nations want to join the BRICS. So the measures are available to us, and the work of, I'm not saying it's causative, be careful with this, it's not causative. It is because the causes of a worldwide geopolitical change will be argued about for centuries, you know. But it is the crew. It allows us to see a turning point. It allows us to express our gratitude to Julian and Chelsea and WikiLeaks for enabling us to measure those changes. And all of that information, every single word of it, you can still call it up on WikiLeaks and investigate for yourself how the empire, the United States, ran the world and the results of that, those techniques of running the world, the last 20 years of constant warfare. That constant warfare is the barometer of an unfolding circumstances which brings opportunity to those who can read or whose ideological outlook doesn't forbid them from reading the changes in the proper context. And this is another thing that Julian and WikiLeaks brought to you, the capacity to sit down for yourself in front of a computer and analyze circumstances. Finally, back then, when the only source of money because of the banking blockade against WikiLeaks and Julian was Bitcoin. I think at the time it was $7 to $12. It is another barometer of change and another circumstance where WikiLeaks, Julian, and the others who helped him are the crew. The turning point, you can see, historically, we can just see the turning point of how this world has unfolded before us, tracking the circumstance. One last point is censorship. Back then, we were so enthralled with the information that flowed from the WikiLeaks computers, ordered in a way that it was completely searchable, that we began an understanding of how the world is managed. Prior to that, you had to sit down and, hopefully a book you were reading or a newspaper that was on your desk would reveal something or other, and you'd just read and read and read, and you'd think, oh my God, these people, they do carry on. When are we ever going to be able to learn something? And all of a sudden, whoosh, everything we wanted to know to assist ourselves and our communities and our families was there in front of us. The gratitude to Assange and Chelsea and others must be expressed in a permanent way, for it gave us I've used the word a few times now, crew, to understand where we are now and how it came about. Thanks.
I know so many people feel immeasurable gratitude, but I think also so many people might feel disheartened by seeing the price that has to be paid for truth. And one thing that Julian recently said is that he's free only because he pleaded guilty to journalism. So that might make people question whether it's worth the risk to speak the truth. What do you say to that? And I'd love to hear from all of you.
Well, I think there's always been cowardice in journalism, unfortunately. And there have also always been courageous, usually individual journalists, sometimes working in difficult circumstances within their newsrooms where editors are trying to shut them down and so on. And what Julian and WikiLeaks managed to do was break with the kind of existing mold and do journalism in a different way. And it took 14 years of persecution and a guilty plea for Julian to regain his freedom. So in that respect, it's not a good outlook, but you have to look at the bigger picture and what WikiLeaks achieved. It transformed journalism for good and created an environment where alternative news outlets, smaller news outlets, where journalists could cater directly to their audience and have massive audiences. I mean, if you look at the biggest, basically podcasters and Tucker Carlson and so on, they reach, magnitudes more of people than the cable news channels and so on, the BBC. And that's basically an aged population that watches all the old channels. So there's been a real transformation, and that was ushered through with WikiLeaks. But you still have now cowardice masquerading as virtue. The latest there was the latest leak about the Israeli plans to strike Iran. There's documents that are circulating on Telegram, I think, and no major newsroom wants to publish them. And why is that? Well, it's because of the prosecution of Julian, and because the US has now secured a conviction under the Espionage Act for receiving, possessing, and communicating national defense information. And there's no question at this point in time where we are that information is in the public interest. So that's where we are now. The newsrooms, talk about responsible journalism and so on, but they've taken a real step back, and that's the real-world effect of not just the guilty plea, It's the fact of the prosecution itself, that they brought this prosecution under the Espionage Act, that the only thing that Julian has pled guilty to is receiving information, possessing it, and communicating it to the public, and information that was of the highest public interest. And that's where we're at.
Gabriel?
Yeah, well, I think Stella and John have both touched on it, that effect of WikiLeaks. Stella spoke to this flowering of independent journalism, that we're seeing happen all over the world, right? Not just in the US context, but it's happening across Europe, in Australia, that these independents are getting more and more of a platform. But I think what contributed to that also was WikiLeaks really tore down the veil on the mainstream media, on the legacy media, on the prestige media, and really showed how they actually worked. And it was through publishing those source documents, original source documents, that that all of us could go on and look at and then compare to, say, an article in the New York Times, and we could understand the bias in the New York Times, precisely. We could understand where that bias lay, not just for the New York Times, but also for CNN, for Fox News, and any other platform, or The Guardian or the Times in London. And so that, I think, from that point in time, if you look at some of the graphs, the fall in trust in this legacy media has just been going down and down, while this flowering of independent journalists has been rising and rising. And that's a direct legacy of Julian and WikiLeaks. But also the technology. The technology, the internet has been very, very powerful in distributing that information to everyone as well. But I think this precedent, this prosecutorial precedent that's been set here in this case, has had a chilling effect all over the world. Stella's spoken on one part of it, but it means that the United States Department of Justice can literally reach into any country around the world, use their secrecy laws to go after people that publish truthful information. And that is very worrying, and we should all be worried about that, whether we're in France, in Switzerland, in Australia, or anywhere else in the world. And what we're working on now, one way to unwind that is we're working very hard on a pardon for Julian from either the outgoing Biden administration or an incoming Harris or Trump administration. And that would be a way to signal to the people who are behind this prosecution, the sort of Mike Pompeos of the world, who was an ex-CIA director, to say, if you push this, if you go after this, it's going to be unwound, so don't waste your time.
And how about you, John? What do you say to people that worry about speaking the truth after this?
Oh, this is going to be tough. I've addressed the sociological and got close to the philosophical aspects in my last answer. And your question seems to be directed towards the psychological, personal. So here in this little spot we're sitting is the size of Julian's cell that he spent the last 5 years in. They're just that bit. We had this plan where I would walk in Spain and then walk to somewhere in Spain, and Julian would follow me, and he would walk up and down his cell and mark off. But because of COVID, it couldn't come about. But often at that time, I imagined what it would be. And people often ask me, would it be worth it? So I can only look inside my head. I can't look inside Julian. And only I can use my imagination to transfer myself into that cell and walk up and down, marking off 3 meters each time on the wall, wearing out sneakers and so on, to get down to Spain. And then add to it your question, was it all worth it? I am horrified that I'm spending 5 years in a little cell walking up and down to get a bit of exercise. And my head a turmoil of regrets, adding sadism to my psychological torture that's been given to, enacted upon me by state authorities. Well, I can't go there. I'm sorry. I would emerge from that place a mad person. So I assume from my own investigations, with my own consciousness, that I wouldn't burden myself with self-sadism, saying, oh, I should have turned left at that corner. That's how I can answer you, only by using my own understanding through the use of my imagination and some embracing empathy for the man so treated.
Understandable, well said. I think that this case makes it very clear that there are not enough safeguards to protect the individual against the state. How can Bitcoin be used as a tool to maybe break that merger of state and money and free the individual through that?
Is that for me?
Any of you can address it.
Well, John briefly spoke about this earlier, but I think WikiLeaks using Bitcoin back in its early days, 2010, 2011, after the extra-legal banking blockade, really was a proof of concept of Bitcoin as uncensorable, totally uncensorable, totally uncensorable money. That even the largest superpower, the United States, with all its might and all its power around the world, they cut off WikiLeaks' PayPal. They cut off Visa, MasterCard donations. They closed its bank accounts. They even closed Julian's personal bank accounts, all without any court or anything like that. It was just totally extra legal. John McCain, I think, was involved at the time. And so turning to Bitcoin at that point, using Bitcoin to keep publishing, to keep online, to make WikiLeaks, totally uncensorable, and having that uncensorable money combined with the architecture of the internet that made the website uncensorable, really, I think, is a testament to the power of Bitcoin, and the power not only of Bitcoin to give us that personal freedom to transact, but for journalists and publishers who are persecuted to use Bitcoin to become uncensorable. And so I think, in terms of, for an individual, we can transact with each other peer-to-peer without any permission. It's totally permissionless from the state, decentralized and all that. But I think on that next level, when you take it up to publishers who want to go against these types of superpowers, who want to go against state actors, using Bitcoin is incredibly powerful and increases our knowledge, increases the knowledge of our community, not just about what the United States government gets up to around the world, but also everything else that WikiLeaks published about, leaks from banks, or also leaks, from Syria or from Russia or from China, that they were able to keep publishing by using Bitcoin.
Well, some of the use cases, it really puts a target on Bitcoin's back. I would love to hear a little bit more about how you see Bitcoin really standing as this tool for freedom as it maybe assimilates into the traditional financial system and the legacy world, when a lot of states do not want it to be a peer-to-peer freedom of transaction network.
Well, I think we're at a really interesting point in time, specifically, like we're 1 week away from the U.S. election, right? And I think the Biden administration has been very stupid because it's basically, through its policies, has made it very easy for the Trump campaign to court the Bitcoin and crypto community. So it's kind of interesting that Trump is going with it. I think the reason is the same reason that Liz Cheney is backing Kamala. That basically the old guard has an in with the Harris campaign, but Trump, at least rhetorically, wants to break with that. And so Trump is saying a lot of interesting things. But I think right now there has to be a lot of scrutiny on, if he wins, who he surrounds himself with, because that's the difference between rhetoric and reality. It's the people, right? Who staffs the administration is the policy, and is he just saying the right things in order to get elected? Is he going to go back to getting people like Pompeo and Sebastian Gorka and these deranged people? I mean, Pompeo, as you all know, plotted Julian's assassination when he was the head of the CIA. And Julian was, when he spoke last month, he talked about wolves in MAGA hats. It's basically wolves in sheep's clothing, that are sucking up to Trump in order to get into the administration. And there's already talks that Pompeo will have some kind of role in the new administration. So in light of that, there has to be a lot of scrutiny. And, the question is whether the Bitcoin community, if he does, continue, if he does kind of deliver, whether that will capture parts of this community or whether it will be in the other direction, right? So I don't know how things will go, but I think it's in everyone's interest to keep a very keen eye on who actually makes up this administration. Because if you have hawks like Pompeo and so on, they're going to push for not just war, but also a very aggressive sanctions policy, which will affect the Bitcoin community or the broader crypto community inevitably. So anyway, I'm very concerned that although he's saying things that appear interesting, and he's recruited some interesting people like Tulsi and RFK Jr., that at the same time it looks like the national security part of the administration will just be continuity, and that's bad. It's bad.
Right. And a lot of people are worried that there is this national security state that's operating behind the scenes, and no matter who gets elected, that will continue. Do you both agree with any of that? Do you have a sense of concern that Bitcoin won't be able to reach the level of adoption and the kind of freedom that it's supposed to represent because the state is so powerful?
Well, I think, I know Snowden's, Edward Snowden's raised this a lot, and then that there are some privacy concerns, right, with Bitcoin, and I think that's something that needs to be addressed in some way, and that's up to a lot of the people here. I know there's a lot of people here who are have been working on Bitcoin for a very long time, and so I think that's a call out to them, and that call should be consistent, coming from people who, like Snowden, who have used Bitcoin, like Julian, who have come up against those state actors, and have identified these issues. So I think as long as Bitcoin can keep evolving, I think in that sense, I think there is a lot of promise for it, even if it's been sort of mainstreamed and intertwined with any administration. But I mean, if you look back to 2011, who would have thought that we would have been having a Bitcoin election, right?
Right.
Yeah, 2011, when Julian was using Bitcoin to publish this information, I don't think no one would have said, well, 2024 is going to be a Bitcoin election, which arguably it is. So I think it's come so far in terms of adoption, but I think it's still needs to be worked on.
Well, and I believe Satoshi actually publicly said that we have to be careful supporting WikiLeaks at the time through Bitcoin because Bitcoin was so new, and to have that type of attention on it, it might be very detrimental.
Yeah, it's that quote,
yeah.
WikiLeaks has kicked the hornet's nest and the swarm is, coming.
Exactly. So is Bitcoin resilient enough at this point?
You know, what we're addressing here is really fun and transcendent, is distributed systems. And I have on my house, my house, I sold it to involve myself in this campaign, but on the roof were solar collectors. I didn't pay any electricity bill, and I monitored my consumption of energy through the telephone. And I was able to modify the consumption relative to what I was earning. I didn't use a credit card to cover the distance between the two. The same with Bitcoin. Is as it is a distributed system, its use is peer-to-peer without going through a platform. The problem that I see, and people are solving it readily, is that the distributed system that we all have in our pockets these days has to go, in some circumstances, through a central platform. I won't name them, they give me the creeps actually. You know, they purloin the productivity of millions of people to enrich themselves and become part of government. This is a problem that's progressively being solved by engineers and technicians and the genius of what we may call the crypto community and others surrounding it. And it will be solved, and we will have a capacity to relate to each other and inform each other and do business commerce with each other without having to go through one of these monstrous centralizing corporations that have a specific relationship to government, which is to our detriment as individuals and communities and families. So that answers your question in the fullest. The engineers will solve the problem. I see the other day that they came up with Gabriel sent me a website which offers some solution to that problem. And as the penetration of crypto in one form or another, Bitcoin in the lead, as it penetrates, these problems will have more minds attending to them, and the solutions will tumble forth, and we'll adopt them with joy. Thank you.
That's the vision. Talk to us a little bit about what's next for Julian, what's next for your family.
Well, it's only been, I think, 4 months now of his freedom after 14 years and 5 years inside a high security prison. So Julian is still in recovery. He did do a public appearance a month ago, and that was really an exception because it was in the context of the Council of Europe, which had appointed a rapporteur to investigate Julian's case and its consequences for freedom of the press in the Council of Europe area. It's not the EU, it's broader than that. It's 46, sorry. And she had just finished her report, and the report was being adopted through a committee. And so the committee invited Julian to speak to them because they had questions. And it was because of the importance of this, formal report and resolution that had that called on, for example, the UK to investigate Julian's imprisonment. And they concluded that Julian was a political prisoner during his imprisonment in Belmarsh. That's a big deal. Like, this is the Council of Europe and the kind of who had elected this person to look into it, and then directs this call to the UK as a whole, saying, you had a political prisoner, investigate how this had come to be. And the UK is just stonewalling. They're not responding to that call. But it was a really important, I think, moment for Julian to be able to speak himself about his case. He said himself he wasn't ready to talk about his imprisonment yet. But it was important for him to be able to speak on his own terms, not in an interview, not in someone else's framing, but in his own framing. And I think the speech is historic, extremely, extremely important, puts everything into its proper historical context. So that was kind of an exception to his recovery, and you can see through his delivery that it's hard. He was very tired. It was grueling, because he's still. It's a long way to restoring his health. But that being said, he's really doing very, very well. He's getting a lot of sun and outdoor, trekking in the Australian outback and this kind of thing. Maybe not proper outback yet, but it's really good. He wanted to see the sea every day, and he sees the sea every day, and he swims in the ocean, and he's really taking it slowly at his own pace, and planning the future. But he's not rushing into it, and I know because Julian has he's such a important figure. I think there are a lot of expectations on him, but he just needs the time to recover. And from that speech in the Q&A afterwards, for anyone who's interested, you can see it. He's engaging, he's looking at the world and thinking about it, and he's also a doer. But he has to get into the position where he can be a doer again. And right now he's taking everything in and catching up with the world. There's a lot to catch up on. He hadn't heard an electric vehicle until he was out, and he finds them very creepy. And all these things that, it's like he's been in a time capsule.
Mm-hmm. Right. So he still needs to process everything that happened to him, that whole experience. And if you haven't seen the public statement he made, it's about 22 minutes long. I highly recommend it. It's a must-see piece of video. And again, Stella was right by his side. How about for you? Just what's next, and what do you hope for Julian as well?
Well, it's just nice to be able to have Julian over for dinner and, cook for him. I don't know if anybody's ever cooked for anybody who's been in prison for 5 years, but they're very appreciative of like a home-cooked meal. I'm not the best cook, but, there was many compliments flowing. I was surprised. But I guess, prison food in Belmarsh, left a lot to be desired. But, it's just nice to have those moments together, have a whiskey together and, just be sort of normal people for a minute, right? Like, we've missed that, as a family for so long, and
it's priceless.
Yeah, it's really good to have those. Obviously, we're pushing for a pardon for Julian as a way to unwind this this prosecution. as I said, whether it's with Biden or Harris or Trump, who knows what's going to happen in the next few weeks, but we'll have a bit more of a focus after the election on what needs to happen. And there's lawmakers in the US. I've travelled to Washington DC 7 times this year advocating for Julian, and a lot of the lawmakers there who supported Julian in Congress and in the Senate are like, what do we do now? They want to continue this fight. They want to continue fighting for freedom of information, for freedom of speech, and a pardon for Julian Assange is one way they can do that.
Wonderful. John, wrap us up here.
Oh, as a wrap, I just want to express my profound gratitude to you all, because it was us all. I mean, can you imagine? The Department of Defense of the United States was an enemy. They got $1 trillion a year and they don't mind killing a few people. The Department of State, another enemy. The Department, well, they call themselves the Central Intelligence Agency. Fancy name for a bunch of murderers, but they're all enemies, and we together, all of us, trounced them all and brought freedom to somebody who represented our interests in the sense of information, and latterly our interests in the sense of freedom. Freedom divided into 3 areas: just to be able to have an ordinary life, to be able to read stuff and accumulate a bit of knowledge so you didn't bore everybody at the dinner table, and to be able to gather together as a group and talk about things that enabled us to have a decent understanding of where the world is. So at his end, just before he walked out of that prison, Julian was an icon of all of those things that I mentioned. And as an icon, taking his freedom, it also is a two-way gift between us and our efforts and him and his efforts. So, thank you.
What a legacy.
Yeah.
What a legacy your family stands for, of fighting for freedom. Thank you so much. I could speak to you for another hour, but unfortunately we are out of time. Everyone, please give another round of applause for Stella Assange, Gabriel Shipton, and John Shipton.
Thank you.